It here talking Za'Darius, talking trades, talking the off season. This is Climbing the Pocket, brought to you by Lake Monster. We got Jayson, Eric, Myles, producer Dave. Let's go. We'll see you on the other side.
Huddle around as Climbing the Pocket Network presents Jayson and the boys talking everything Minnesota Vikings.
What up, y'all? We are live. Happy Za'Darius Day to all who celebrate. Before we get going, gotta say what's up to Nick, Ryan, Brandon, Dan. There's Ryan again, Sean, Anna, and Daniel, all in the chat, all saying what's up. How y'all doing? Let's hop to it. It's in the huddle. We got the man, the myth, the legend, the good doctor, Eric Eager, my man. How you doing? How you been?
The offseason's been crazy. I think if the Vikings were a little bit more active, I might have been on last week, but I think I picked the right day to hop on here. It was a good day for the Vikings, and I'm of course talking about the Sean Mannion re-signing.
Sure you were.
That already caused a lot of angst last week. And Myles, my man, how you doing?
What up? Good. You guys are here, so I'm good.
Word. Well, let's do this. Eric, it's been a minute. So, when we get you in here, I gotta save up all the things that I read on Twitter, Reddit, all the folks being upset with, analytics people who think they're smarter than the folks who are running teams and all of that. And so throughout this offseason, actually before really the offseason for the Vikings kicked off, there was maybe a feeling from folks on this network, smart people around the Vikings sphere that, maybe, Kwesi was going to come in. They'd strip this thing down to the studs. The Vikings weren't really contenders. They would maybe have like a real rebuild and kind of see what happens, building this team from the ground up, the way maybe we'd seen in places like Cleveland, other things like that. And at the start of this offseason, the Vikings offseason felt a lot like a Rick and Mike sort of offseason. We're going to move some money around with the vets who are already here. We signed Kirk to another extension that seems to give him all the leverage as we roll things into the future. And Vikings fans weren't really feeling it, weren't feeling good about things. But on the other side, you had some detractors maybe saying that, hey, look, this is Kwesi coming in and showing all of you that maybe you don't know as much as you think you know about how a team should be built. Kwesi's a smart guy. He's coming in. He's extended Kirk Cousins. They've created some cap space. Today, you got Za'Darius coming in, bolstering that front seven for the Vikings. And the Vikings seem to be looking at this as hey, we're ready to contend in this upcoming football season. And Eric, I'm looking for your take on all of these things, the Vikings offseason plans to date, and what appears to be the Vikings throwing the chips into the middle, saying like, hey, we're ready to contend. We're ready to mix it up. We're ready to play with the big boy teams in the NFC based on the moves we've made this offseason.
Yeah, I think there are reality. I think it's really frustrating if you are a fan of the team and a fan of Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, just because. And I think Sam Monson, who is my colleague at PFF, who spent a year in Rochester, Minnesota, as a kid and as a Vikings fan, sort of was like, look, if we're never going to, if we're never going to rebuild now, when are we going to? Like, I think that's really I think that's really the disappointing part, right? Was like, this team has only ever rebuilt after complete necessity, right? I think about the Mike Tice years. In 2002, they stripped it down. 2011 kind of had to, after the Brett Favre fiasco. I think that's really the year that the Wilfs look at and say, we never want this again. And so I think there's some frustration there, because I think that most of the fan base has grown weary of Kirk Cousins. I think that, even though Kirk Cousins has had a couple good years in a row, he kind of declined in the second half of last year. And, there's questions about him at 34 years old, being able to run it back with a team full of players who are also getting older, with the exception of Justin Jefferson. And then there's the overwhelming evidence around the league of what is winning, which is, the Herberts and the Joe Burrow is probably a better example. The Mahomes on his rookie deal, like all these teams loading the hell up on players, when their quarterback's on a rookie deal, and then teams grabbing a truly elite quarterback to put around a great roster, Rams and the Tampa Bay Bucks, to win the last two Super Bowls. And I think I think that feeling like you're left out is probably like a little bit of an issue here. Now, like there's in my opinion, there's obviously it's harder to do this job than I think a lot of us believe, and there are a lot of pressures probably from ownership to try to be good. And I think that the NFC also being kind of a dumpster fire is not helping either the folks who wanted to rebuild. But I think it's kind of a milquetoast offseason. And even with this Za'Darius Smith acquisition, I think Smith was a fantastic player for the Green Bay Packers, but he, like Danielle Hunter, I mean, those two guys played at less than 400 snaps last year. So it sort of shows you the kind of gambles you have to make if you are going to try to win with Kirk Cousins as your quarterback.
And on that front, so when we're looking at something like the signing of Za'Darius, I know that you've mentioned in the past that coverage is the supremely important thing if you're looking to win in today's NFL, but it's a little bit easier to predict typically when you're looking to sign like in the front seven. Like you can probably project with a bit more certainty like who's going to be a good pass rusher versus like who's going to be good in coverage like next season. Does that seem to be what the Vikings are banking on when you say they're making a gamble? Is that hope that, injuries notwithstanding, like it's easier to project, a great pass rusher versus, spending top dollar and hoping that you get another great season in coverage from an elite cornerback?
Well, yeah, exactly. And here's the thing, like the Vikings don't need one cornerback. They need three. They need three players who can play the position well. And so if you're going to go out there and use, $10 million in this case of Za'Darius Smith, and I know it was backloaded, $14 million or so, and you're going to spend that on one cornerback, their defense is still going to stink, because, offenses can really attack the weak link. And we've seen that a number of times with Minnesota over the past 3 years, especially when they've had injuries because their depth has been so poor. that, defenses can exploit the weak link. My guess is, knowing, Kwesi and sort of thinking about sort of how teams like Cincinnati have done it, for example, I think that they're probably going to draft like 3 or 4 cornerbacks in this draft, and hopefully, three of the 4 work out and are competent players. That still doesn't cover up the fact that on the defensive line, they have no depth. And if Hunter or Smith or both got hurt, they would fall to a similar fate as last year in the pass rush. I don't think it, I think one of the underlying issues of what happened last season, and this could be very well due to the defensive line struggling, but Eric Kendricks had a really a poor season last year. Jordan Hicks, the guy they acquired, had a pretty good season in 2021, but he's coming off of 2 seasons where he forced the Arizona Cardinals to draft Isaiah Simmons and then Zaven Collins in the first round to replace him for 2 consecutive years. So even the linebacker core, it's still a gamble there that both Hicks and Kendricks will be good players. And again, like I said, look, they've decided to go down this road with Cousins. They have to make these gambles. But I'm just here to say that they are gambles. And if they all hit, I think that they could be a good team, especially in this conference where there aren't any, other than Green Bay, LA, and Tampa Bay, there aren't and maybe Dallas, there aren't super elite teams in this division, and it's not in this conference, and it's not a deep conference, right? If they miss the playoffs again in 2022, they're going to miss the playoffs because teams like the Giants and the Eagles and the Cardinals and kind of crappy teams like that end up making it.
So Myles, one of the things that you've said a lot throughout this offseason is that the rest of the teams in the NFC shouldn't really be influencing what the Vikings do, that the Vikings should be doing what's right for the Vikings for the long term. So when Eric brings up the fact that maybe it is a softer NFC this year, maybe it is an easier conference where a few things maybe roll your way, that you could be a team that gets hot and does well and makes a run in the playoffs. Does that change at all what you think about how the Vikings have approached this offseason, maybe how the Vikings should have approached this offseason?
It doesn't for me, but I understand the approach, especially when you get the pressure from ownership and leadership group within the Vikings to win now, because they want to make sure that ownership wants to make sure that it was Mike Zimmer and Rick Spielman's fault more than anything. That's what it seems like. They want to feel good that they're paying 2 people not to coach and work for them because that was the right move. I think that's what it feels like. But at the same time, I think what we'd originally thought Kwesi was going to do with his first year as a first-time GM, Kevin O'Connell, first-time head coach, was take a step back, make some moves to free up cap space and free up yourself for the long term. Whereas and then hope you can hit in 2023, 2024 with Kwesi on a short-term contract, 4 years. That's not a lot of time. And hoping to prove that he can get an extension, after the 2023, after the 2024 season. Well, in reality, it looks like what they're going to do is try to win now and next year. And maybe then Kwesi can say, all right, you've seen what I can do for the first 2 years with your approach. Because at some point they're gonna have to tear it down because they have too many aging, expensive players. They've kicked too much of the money down the road. They've done the old regime started it. They've continued in it now. So what they need to do now is bite that bullet and just go in with it. And if they can prove that they can make the playoffs, maybe back to back in 2 years in a row or what have you, if they can make a mini run or whatever, then Kwesi can go to the Wilfs and say, all right, you've seen what I could do with your method. Let me take mine, but I need an extension. And that extension is going to be more of a 3 or 4 year additional extension, not this weak ass short-term extension, short-term deal they gave him. So I think that's kind of the approach he's going to have to take now. But at the same time, kind of what Eric laid out, it just makes the margin for error that much smaller. We've seen it already the last 2 years. The Kwesi and Kevin O'Connor are in the same position as Rick and Zim put themselves in, but now they have a no margin for error, but they also don't have the same experience that Mike Zimmer and Rick Spielman had. And so, yes, they still might improve. They might do you see that. I think the Smith signing was a good signing. Once they decided that Kirk was coming back, once they decided Danielle and all the other ones were coming back, making a move like Za'Darius Smith is a good one. But at some point, you just kind of wonder, can they do enough and create enough margin for error for themselves so that if they do get a key injury somewhere, that they can kind of overcome it. Because what we've seen the last couple of years is they haven't been able to overcome any of those small, even smaller type moves. And then you look at like the cornerback position that Eric talked about. They need three positions. They need three players at that position, not just one or two. And you can't just focus on the draft. But at the same time, what they shouldn't do is go overpay an older Patrick Peterson or someone like a Patrick Peterson to fill one spot. They should dole out, that $8-9 million for three cornerbacks, because at least then you can help give yourself a little bit more depth, a little bit more potential, and instead of just focusing on one player. We'll see what they end up doing, but I like Patrick Peterson. I'm like flipping this into a Patrick Peterson combo, but like I like Patrick Peterson, but I'm almost in a situation where they should decide to spread that money out a little bit more and go for quality or quantity too, along with hopefully with some decent quantity or at least upside.
So a sentiment that I've seen now
think
pop up in the comments a couple times here is that the Vikings are a good team. They had bad leadership, which is something that Mike Myles was speaking to related to the Wilfs. And then someone Skull Vikes has just posted like, hey, we just signed a dynamic pass rusher, and like we're talking about like a rebuild or something like that. So I guess maybe let's level set. Eric, could you maybe help us speak to like where the Vikings stacked up if we're thinking about them from an analytic perspective, or like if we're looking at them from a more objective point of view, like where did the Vikings kind of rank or stack rank versus the rest of the league last year? And then like based on what they've done this offseason, how have they improved relative to their competition?
Well, yeah, and one thing I want to piggyback off of what Myles said, just briefly, which is the Vikings. If the look of this looks like the Vikings, and I think the fans bought into this, which is really interesting. I know our friend Flip, when I was suggesting that Zimmer and Spielman should go 2 or 3 years ago, thought I was a complete idiot, and now everybody seems to think, oh, Zimmer and Spielman were the number one issue with this team, no questions asked. And basically what the gamble is right now is that those two men can do so. Essentially the systems are fine, the operators of the systems are better now, and that should be able to squeak out an edge that makes them better than previous years, right? Like they're not redoing the systems, right? Like Kwesi Adofo-Mensah got hired in January. He has not hired an analytics group, right? They're drafting players with the same scouts and the same people, like doing all the reports and stuff that Spielman was, right? Like and that's 25% of his first contract. So essentially what Vikings fans who are optimistic about the team are thinking is that those two men can basically improve just by those two people being in the place of Spielman and Zimmer. I believe in Kwesi because I think he's very smart, and I think he has good process. I think he's been around people that have good process. So I do believe he can just simply draft better than Spielman, but there's a ton of evidence to suggest that drafting well is not easy to do. The edges are extremely thin, and when you have just 4 years to do it, it's going to be really hard to do. The other one that I'm a little worried about is I'm not even we're always everybody's sort of believing that Kevin O'Connell is this great head coach, which like there's zero evidence to suggest that that's true yet. Like this is how fickle this can be. When Mike McCarthy joined the Packers in 2006, he was coming off of a season where he led the San Francisco 49ers to one of the worst offenses in football, and he became a pretty damn good coach for the Packers. So this is not necessarily predictive, but it's interesting to talk about. When Kevin O'Connell was the offensive coordinator for the Washington football team, they were one of the worst offenses in football. When he had his chance to coach Kirk Cousins had one of his worst seasons, and that immediately after Kevin O'Connell coached Kirk Cousins as his offensive coordinator, the Washington football team traded Kendall Fuller and a 3rd-round pick to Kansas City and paid Alex Smith a 4-year contract. So that's just to answer those questions about, we just plug and play two people right there and it's going to be a lot better. That's where some of my skepticism is. Now, to your question, Jason, like, look, the Vikings, everybody talks about how many close games they lost. And that's certainly true. And I think if they were like the Ravens and they finished 0-6 with 5 close losses, I'd be persuaded. And the Ravens did have close wins early in the year. But the Vikings, every one of their games were close, right? You flip a couple of their close wins, and they're a 4-win team. Just as easily as you flip some of their close losses. They were, very poor efficiently defensively. On offense, everybody talks about they led the league in 3 and outs. Their drive success was pretty poor relative to their play success. And, they were basically a 0 point differential team. Like, they were exactly what their record says they were. Now, it came in a very frustrating way for Vikings fans. I can understand that. But they weren't, you look back at Vikings history, there's like a Vikings team in like 1990 that had like a plus 80 point differential and finished 6-10. That's not who this team is. They're an 8-9 team. And so, they have a long climb. And to the last thing I'll say, and this is why I know there was a commenter, they're being very nice to me, that compared this team to the Rams. The Rams had the most wins above replacement by non-quarterbacks in the NFL in 2020. So when they brought Matthew Stafford onto that team, that was putting a quarterback onto a Super Bowl team. The Vikings had the 21st most wins above replacement for non-quarterbacks last year. Their roster after the quarterback was bad, and it's been bad for 2 years. They have great players. They have, Justin Jefferson. They have, Dalvin Cook, although Dalvin Cook declined last year. Eric Kendricks declined last year. But I think one of the things that fandom causes someone to do is they don't look at the rest of the league. Every team has a player like Justin Jefferson. Maybe not at wide receiver, but they do at like edge or tackle or something like that. Every team has an Eric Kendricks like player. Maybe not at middle linebacker, but somewhere on the team. And when you add it all up, the Vikings are just not a star-studded team. They're a team that has some stars, but there's not a great roster. They have to improve just to probably stay the same. And when you look at what they're leaving, Xavier Woods played a lot of snaps last year. Patrick Peterson played a lot of snaps last year. Nick Vigil played a lot of snaps last year. Michael Pierce played a lot of snaps last year. Everson Griffin played a lot of snaps last year. And Mackenzie Alexander played a lot of snaps last year. So on the defensive side of the ball, like, I think you can make an argument they have stayed the same, maybe a little bit better, but I think most Vikings fans believe that they've gotten a lot better.
Myles, anything that you want to say that's different from that, or do you want to pivot into like what you think needs to happen in order for maybe the Vikings to salvage this offseason from your perspective, outside of just, hey, we signed a splash free agent?
I think what I kind of mentioned before, they have to keep adding pieces. Now, I think this is their one quote unquote like big splash impact piece that they're going to be able to add. They don't have, now that they converted Danielle Hunter's bonus into a signing bonus and all that, they freed up some cap space. What they don't have that much more flexibility. Like, yes, they can do Eric Kendricks. Yes, they can do Dalvin Cook. They shouldn't do those guys. Their contracts though, like, they can't do everyone. And then as like the flexibility they had next year, they had over like $70 million in cap space for 2023. Well, they've already eaten into over half of that, probably more. I know they can move on from guys next year, and they might, who knows? But more so, they just need to add bodies because they don't have depth. We have to get depth, but they also still are missing starters. You're missing, because they're shifting to a 3-4. They're missing another defensive end. They have their 2 outside linebackers. They have Harrison Phillips. They have Dalvin Tomlinson. They're probably missing another defensive end. And then obviously like 3 cornerbacks. They probably need another depth safety, like a veteran safety. They don't have to be expensive, but they need someone there to compete and be depth for Bynum and Smith. Offensive line, interior offensive line needs some help. They need someone to either back up or compete with Garrett Bradbury, and they need someone to either compete with or start over Wyatt Davis, Oli Udoh at right guard. So, and then you can always use depth at tight end, and you can use depth at wide receiver. I just don't think those are things you should pass up. So Playmakers are always a big thing. So they need those things. And the starters that we've seen the last 2 years haven't been great. And all of the great players that we've talked about on this team are getting older. Now, besides a Justin Jefferson, besides a Brian O'Neill, a few of those young guys, they're all getting into their 30s, and they're at the tail end of their careers. And so the window, like if you want to call it a window, still it's now. But the hard part for Kwesi is he has to like walk this weird fine line of, I want to go all in because that's kind of where I have to position myself, but I don't want to completely mortgage the future for right now because we know that we're not winning a championship this year. I don't think anybody could be unrealistic and say this team's a Super Bowl contender. Like, they're not. They haven't done anything to show that. And but to be a playoff contender, I think that's a little bit of a different story. And I think Kwesi's got to walk that line of, how do we just make ourselves a playoff contender, to actually be a playoff contender, not just a fringe,
consistently,
maybe make the playoffs, consistently be a playoff contender. So he's got to walk that fine line. And so I think using whatever remaining money they have, they got to find some value signings. Like, they have to. Like, they got to find some guys that they can get value out of.
Can I jump in just real quick? Because there's just a couple comments that are just like, they're just too good. Like, I feel like I need to.
My man Dwayne
like,
over here
Dwayne,
gets it.
like my man Dwayne, we like to think that like our opinions mean something. Like, let's just be real. Like, we're some dudes talking on the internet. They don't. Like, if we had the power by just talking to make the Vikings win, guess what? They would have won a long time ago, because all of us want the Vikings to win. Mary asked earlier, what's our level of excitement? It's the off season. The level of excitement's always 10 before they start playing games. Like, all of this is exciting. Talking about the possibilities, talking about the way the team can go, trying to understand, trying to learn. Like, this is the exciting part of it all, right? Like, just shutting off your brain and being like, Vikings did it, so it's good. I mean, if you want that, sure, but this probably isn't the pod. This probably isn't the YouTube channel. Like, this isn't the one for you. If that's all you're looking for is for someone to say, oh, the Vikings did it, so it's great, find Paul Allen. This isn't that channel. Like, that's not what we do.
There's only one Paul Allen, by the way. You can't be him.
Yeah, there's only one.
Well,
we can't be him.
We
so
even
we're going to try to talk about it and understand it.
But the Za'Darius Smith signing.
Here's what I'll say.
The Za'Darius Smith signing was a good signing. I mean, once they decided to go with Kirk Cousins, once they decided to bring back Adam Thielen and Eric Hendricks and once they decided to bring all those players back, Za'Darius Smith was a good signing. We can talk about that. Like, he's a good player. If him and Danielle Hunter can stay healthy, they're going to wreak havoc. They're going to do good things for this team. But it's more than, it's not just about them. There is so much more to this team than just a couple really good players.
Oh, and we do this every year. Like, this is what I don't get. Is like we go through this song and dance every single year. And here's what I'll say. In 2020, like right around when free agency started, and they extended Kirk Cousins the first time, and Spielman said, "Hey, this is so we can sign Michael Pierce," is what he said.
Right.
Michael Pierce was previously the most expensive free agent signing in the Kirk Cousins era, 3 years, $27 million. Za'Darius Smith is now the most expensive signing in the Kirk Cousins era. But Spielman also said, and then he also talked about in a interview just recently, where he also said, look, like our goal is to make the playoffs every single year. And I think Kirk Cousins is actually not a terrible quarterback to have that goal with, right? Like, the goal is to play meaningful games in January. And that was part of what Spielman said as well, is like, ownership for this team, they care about what the fans think, and they care about what the media says. And they want to turn on NFL Network and see them being relevant. That's why they gave Dalvin Cook the deal. That's why they gave, that's why they love having Justin Jefferson. That's why they loved, and they love being relevant. I think the issue, though, is to do so because, again, you can optimize for being the 5th seed in this NFC and succeed while failing at trying to win a Super Bowl, right? Like, I think we're all mature enough to see that, right? Like, if you go all in on making the playoffs in 2022, like, that's fine, but your chances of probably winning a Super Bowl in the next 10 years are going to be a little bit lower if you do it a certain way. And that's, I think, where some fans of the team want this team. A team, by the way, everybody calls me negative, has been one of the best franchises in the NFL if you look at wins and losses since the 70s, and has been basically a 500 team since the Wolves have owned it. They're not a bad franchise, but I think most fans are kind of growing tired of the 8 and 9s, the 9s and 8, the 8 and 8, the 10 and 6, and you don't really have a chance, the 6 and 10, and let's talk ourselves into 3 more wins, all that kind of stuff. And again, I think a lot of fans, when we don't want to see people get fired, Spielman and Zimmer, but if they were going to, I think that the hope for many fans was like, let's have an actual rebuild for the first time in many of our lifetimes, right? That was the hope. And I think that instead of being negative, I think a lot of us are just looking at it and saying, okay, well, this is not what we would have preferred, but let's see what they're trying to do here.
Well, and to Mary's point, Mary's talking about being excited about the future. And I have a hard time being excited about the future when they're running back the same roster as what we've seen, and we've seen the outcome of that roster. And again, I think there's improvements, and the hope is that Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell are good enough at their job to have a positive impact this year. And we just don't know that answer. And of course, the unknown is super. It can be really fun because Kevin O'Connell as an offensive coach, we haven't seen what he wants fully to do with this offense, with Kirk Cousins, with Justin Jefferson, with Dalvin Cook. I'm really excited to see what that's going to look like. But we can't also just say that it's automatically going to be the LA Rams. Like we can't just sit here and say it's going to be a carbon copy of what the LA Rams have been the last handful of years under Sean McVay either. Like we can't just say that. We don't fully know. What we have is what we've seen from Kevin O'Connell in Washington, what we've seen with him recently in LA. But we don't have those same players, and we also don't have the same amount of true talent, top to bottom. And there is a lot of talent on the team. I'm excited to see what they can do with it, but they ran back a lot of the same players as the old regime. So I'm not going to be like, oh my gosh, the next 2 to 3 years are going to be super exciting because we know that they have X, Y, and Z. We just you're hoping that these aging players can still have that fountain of youth and can play at a high level and not get hurt and those things. And so again, it's not trying to be negative. I'm just trying to think about it as a broad perspective of where is this team currently and what do they look like heading into the season, and again, there's a Za'Darius Smith signing was a good one, but they still need more pieces. It's not just a one piece and we're ready to go. Just like going into the draft. I know a lot of people are like, oh, it has to be a cornerback in the first round. They need more than that. It's not just one impact player. Like no matter what player they take in the first round, they need more than one impact player. And that's, again, goes back to the margin of error that's very slim for this team. So they have to hit on a few guys or hope that some of the previous players that they've drafted from last year and the year before can continue to accelerate and ascend. And we just don't know that answer.
So, Eric, question for you. Thomas has said that, we have a talented team trapped in a dinosaur system because of Mike Zimmer. And so one of the big bets I think the Vikings are making, bringing in the young, fresh offensive coordinator, bringing an modern offensive system to the Vikings, is that, the offensive side of the ball, it's more stable from year to year. Kirk Cousins is a very good quarterback. He can run a system. He's the person that if you have a great system, he's going to do what the system tells you to do. And I think that we could probably even have an argument that Kirk Cousins, Matthew Stafford, kick all that stuff off again. But you might be able to make an argument that, Kirk Cousins is a better quarterback than Matthew Stafford, who just won the Super Bowl with the Rams, which is something that I've seen come up very often, right? And so we may see the Vikings offense get better than it has been in recent years. The other side of that is the defense, though. And Mike Zimmer, for all of his challenges, maybe running a full team, game management, one of the things that seems to be very consistent through Mike Zimmer's tenure with the Vikings is that he was able to squeeze a lot of talent out of that defense. He was able to manufacture stats and pressures with players who weren't particularly talented. So I'm interested in kind of what you think we might see in terms of how things go next season with maybe the offense getting better, where the defense might be. And like, if we are talking about the Vikings as a contending sort of team, like what should we need to see from those units in order for them to be a team that can make a little bit of noise versus just a team that maybe backs into the playoffs or something like that?
Yeah, I look, I was not a huge fan of Zimmer at the end, but to expect that Donatell to be as good of a defensive play caller as him is going to be a stretch, right? Like, I think we'll all look, and Zimmer was a prick at the end. He was pretty bad at in-game stuff. He alienated a lot of players. The Kellen Mond thing is probably one of the more abhorrent, sort of treatments of a young player that we've seen. Didn't like to play rookies. There's a lot of bad about Zimmer, but Zimmer's defensive scheme was one of the better ones in football. Like, we're 2 calendar years removed from him. I mean, his defensive game plan against the Saints with Andrew Sendejo playing nickel and, not a great team to begin with was a masterpiece. And so I think we have to level set and say, okay, Donatell is going to have to work with probably worse personnel, right? We just talked about the secondary, as bad as it was last year, is going to be worse this year in all likelihood. The linebacking core, Kendricks is a year older. Safety, their best player on defense, probably maybe the best player on their team. Harrison Smith is a year older again, right? And Zimmer always used Harrison Smith in optimal ways. Is that Donatell going to do that? So I think that there are questions there. Donatell is going to have to be brilliant. I think to make this
the players, Eric. So I was just gonna say the players also have a brand new scheme to learn. Like a lot of these guys have run the same scheme for 8. Like most of these guys have been here 2012, 2013, 2015. Like these guys have been here for a long time, and it's not that they won't be able to pick up on something new, but it is something new, and it's not a different 4-3. It's a 3-4 where they're gonna mix in some 4-3 fronts and those things, but it's a whole new scheme. It's a whole new like verbiage. That stuff can take time to implement and understand and to kind of to process, especially when you've known the same thing for so long. And so that's just another part of it that I would just caution about is like there are going to be growing pains, like there are, and that should be expected. That once they decided that they were bringing the band back, I said no excuses, but I also know there are going to be growing pains. Like there has to be. Because everyone's new.
Well, and I think that that's like part of the issue. That's part of the reason why the guys like us don't like the run it back thing, because you guys remember 2014. So the Vikings gave up 30 points a game in 2013. They were 32nd in the NFL, I believe, that year. I can't remember exactly. And
it was rough.
They come in, they move on from Jared Allen, they go with Everson Griffin in his spot. They put Xavier Rhodes in a premium position on that team. They put Harrison Smith. They move him around. I thought the Leslie Frazier defense did a terrible job of accentuating Harrison Smith. Zimmer did a great job. But that 2014 team, there were bad games, right? There were growing pains, and I think every single one of us was encouraged by that season, even with those, and even with the 7-9 finish, and even with all that kind of stuff. And so, by the way, Dwayne, I love you, Dwayne, but like you can't say this guy sucked because we lost an NFC Championship game. That's not actually how it works. But anyway, getting rolled by Nick Foles was a privilege. But anyway, so so again, like that's part of the problem with running it back, though, is all the stuff that Myles talked about, which is there are going to be growing pains this year, right? And to the point is, like, why didn't the Vikings make the playoffs last year? They didn't make the playoffs last year because they started slow. They started 1-5 in 2020, and they started 1-3 this year, and they weren't able. They were behind the 8 ball the entire year, right? Do we think they're going to come out of the gates blazing this year with the new defense that way? Like, I don't think so. And again, on offense, I get the positivity surrounding O'Connell, but the Vikings offense for the last 3 years has been playing to accentuate Kirk's strengths, right? Like play action on early downs, check downs like the offense the last 3 years has been playing to get Kirk the highest passer rating possible. Right? Like that like the offense is Goodhart's law in a nutshell.
Eric, the worst offensive coordinator they've had in the Kirk Cousins era last year, he still produced the best like PFF grade, his best metrics from like an analytics standpoint of his career with the worst offensive coordinator that they've had in Clint Kubiak. And so I always thought that was super funny that like people want to talk about like, and we like, I hate having to repeat myself. Kirk Cousins is a very good quarterback. Like, I think Kevin O'Connell is going to help Kirk Cousins, but like, yes. And so I just think it's funny that like Clint Kubiak, awful offensive coordinator, he still was able to help Kirk have his best career statistically. And Kirk then got another fully guaranteed 2-year deal. Like, I don't know what people need.
Jason, put up Mateo's comment here. This one, speaking of privileges. So, okay, I'll grant you that Zimmer didn't draft Xavier Rhodes, but Xavier Rhodes was terrible at first, and then he was a Pro Bowl all pro corner. Trey Waynes, you can say what you want about Trey Waynes, but Trey Waynes got a $14 million. Like Trey Waynes got the exact same contract 2 years ago, pre-inflation, that the Za'Darius Smith contract we're all slurping today. He got that contract from the Bengals, so he clearly doesn't. Because Zimmer clearly made him look good. Mackenzie Alexander, same thing. Mackenzie Alexander had some good years. He had the corpse of Terrence Newman playing nickel corner in the NFC Championship game. Harrison Smith's going to make the Vikings Ring of Honor. He probably is a couple good years away from making the Hall of Fame in the NFL. Almost all of that was Zimmer. Anthony Harris earned a franchise tag from this team after being undrafted. Come on, let's stop pretending that just because the Zimmer thing ended bad that the guy sucked. Okay, he ran his course. Yeah. At the end, he got a bad. They were all in. It was a bad marriage at the end, but it was a good love affair at the beginning. Let's be honest. But the problem, yeah. And here's the thing with Cousins that no one is talking about. He got worse as the season progressed last year. PFF grades, efficiency. The guy's 34 years old. The other part of extending him is buying him at the literal very top of the market. That's the other issue with running it back here, is that he played well enough so that you could not get that much relief from extending him. And you're probably buying the peak of his performance. Like almost everybody has some sort of peak and declines. We're talking about Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan's been kind of ass for the last couple years after his peak, right? The Falcons bought that peak. By the way, the Vikings.
We don't talk bad about Matt Ryan.
Yeah, exactly.
I like Matt Ryan.
But you guys know what I'm saying? Like, so the Kirk people want to think that Kirk's just going to get better, and I do not. I'm selling that idea.
Yeah.
So Myles, one thing Dwayne wants to talk about the offensive line.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, like, I know people are yelling at us about being negative. Well, let's spin this a little bit and talk about some of the positivity that this team does have, because there are, right? There are, like, it isn't all negative, and I don't want it to feel that way.
We're not talking about the offensive line?
We're not talking about the offensive line. Well, not positively. No, honestly, like the one thing I will say about the one thing I will say about Kevin O'Connell, his approach so far to the offensive line is, I don't think they're going to do anything too drastically different than the old regime. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think one thing we need to allow the new regime to have is time to understand maybe it was a little bit of the coaching that was holding back the current offensive line. That's not to say a guy like Garrett Bradbury is going to all of a sudden be an all-pro level center, but maybe they feel there were some things that they were being taught that could be tweaked or fixed, that could fix a little bit of some of the issues that they had. Not Bradbury all like specifically, but like in general across the offensive line. Like maybe there is some like Ezra Cleveland, maybe there's another level they can help coach Ezra Cleveland to Christian Darrisaw's young, a guy that they can develop. Brian O'Neill's a really good player. So like there are pieces on the offensive line that are solid. Now maybe the coaching that was lacking before, maybe they can develop that a little bit more with the new coaching. And so maybe they see a guy like Garrett Bradbury, like a Brian Allen in LA, who, mind you, was really bad for the first few years of his career, and all of a sudden just played really well at a really good clip for the Rams last year and helped them on their offensive line win the Super Bowl. And so I'm not saying Garrett Bradbury is going to get to that level, but maybe there is a little bit more that they can get out of Bradbury that the old regime couldn't. So I'm hesitant. I said this a while back. I wouldn't be surprised if Garrett Bradbury is the starting center for the team in week 1. And maybe they add I know Ryan Bates is the one guy they talked about. Maybe they add a veteran depth player, and then they add somebody in the draft, and that's kind of about it. But I wouldn't expect anything significant to come with the offensive line, because I really do think that they want to get in here and get their hands on those guys. Go ahead, Aaron. Right, Eric.
The Bradbury thing is also instructive. And here's why. The Vikings drafted him probably what? At the time, we all thought, what, like 10, 15 picks too early, right?
Now everybody's yelling at me. Now everybody's yelling at me for being positive. Okay.
I know. Look, the truth hurts. The truth hurts. Being the bearer of the truth, it's a lift. Bradbury, Eric McCoy, and was it Elton Jenkins were basically the same projection, and they went 30 picks later. We all thought Bradbury was a little bit too highly picked. And people will say, "Oh, you're blaming Kirk for this pick." Well, okay, if you are a team that has to build through the draft because your quarterback is paid as much as Kirk is, right? Your draft picks are going to be needy that way, right? And so the problem with Garrett Bradbury isn't necessarily that he sucks. It's that the expectations were too high in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Like interior offensive linemen in the NFL take the time.
People are just you try to say one nice thing about somebody because
take forever to emerge, right? And so when you have a quarterback like Kirk Cousins and you're still trying to compete, you are going to treat draft picks as though they're high-priced free agents, meaning that they have to come in and compete away, right?
They have to, because your margin for error. Yeah.
Yeah. When the Vikings drafted Trey Waynes, where did Trey Waynes go for the first 2 years? The bench. Because they had a rookie quarterback deal in Teddy. They had a defense that was full of players that they could buy because they had money, and they could afford a luxury pick at the first pick. Now they got lucky and picks 2 through 5 all were Pro Bowlers, but that's the difference, right? Like that. The hard part about this team is we look at Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, and he might not be able to even make the optimal draft picks because they have to play right away. Like the guy who's picked in the first round for the Vikings this year is going to have to play right away.
Yep.
And so you're probably going to have to take a position that is a play right away position, or you're going to take a player at a developmental position and force him to play right away.
Yeah, Jake, I got asked.
Jake,
about
we're trying to talk
line,
about player development, bro.
we talked about, like, we know Christian Darrisaw. Like, I think Christian Darrisaw has a bright future. Brian O'Neill's really good. I think Ezra Cleveland's a solid left guard. I think he played pretty decent last year. Hopefully, he can play a little bit better. Like, you have two spots left, right guard and center. The one guy, Garrett Bradbury, I mean, I tried to find a positive angle to take. That's it. They're not going to replace him. They're not replacing him. So, like, we gotta deal with it. Like, that's kind of what it is, right? Like, we gotta deal with it. But I think maybe he could be okay.
People are saying they're going to trade Bradbury. I mean, what are they going to trade?
I mean, you're not trading.
Who's going to trade?
All right, so gentlemen, as we're getting to the end of the show,
Bradley, stop it.
I would like you both to let us know, and shout out to the man Mathieu from Montreal. Montreal, excellent city. Everyone should visit it often. Vikings are on the clock. First round. Eric, who are you picking?
I So I was going to say before today, because I actually did not think that they were going to take or they were going to get Smith. And I'd still consider this if he fell to them at 12. George Karlaftis of Purdue is a defensive lineman, less than 21 years old, who I really like. I don't think that that's going to be the pick. I think right now, and this would be the second highest drafted corner in the history of the Vikings. If Trent McDuffie or Ahmad Sauce Gardner fell to them, I would certainly entertain that. Derek Stingley, if he fell to them, I'd rush to the counter. Stingley was the most valuable non-quarterback most valuable defensive player in college football in 2019. He's had injuries. I think he's going to fall. So any of those three corners, to me, I think would be a perfect pick for them. But again, you have to come with expectations. He pick him, but also pick like three other guys at corner and let them duke it out.
Myles, are you going the same way? Like, it seems like we were going into this offseason really excited that we weren't going to know what the Vikings were going to do in the draft. And here we are where
Now
like
we're gonna know.
95% of mock drafts have the Vikings picking a corner. So are you going the same way, or are you going in a different direction?
I mean, I'm always the type, like, my whole goal I'm not the one making the decisions, but like the goal should always be going in the draft, not having major immediate needs. Not that you can't fill needs in the draft, but like it shouldn't be a glaring hole. You should have someone there that's a viable player that can fill the position so that you're not forcing yourself to take a specific player in the first or second round because you have to. And so my goal is always take the best player available or trade back. Like if you can find that, great. I think with where this team is, so one thing, Eric, you said this would be the highest cornerback taken. Trey Waynes was taken with the 11th pick.
11th.
So
11th.
Yeah,
second highest.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So
second highest.
Yeah, I mean, if for some reason Sauce Gardner fell, Stingley, Booth, like I'm cool with those guys. I would also wide receiver. I think like if a Drake London, that's his name, right? Yeah, it's not London Drake. I always forget.
Mm-hmm.
He's always get that.
Garrett Wilson might number one wide receiver might be there when they pick.
I was just gonna say if one of those top wide receivers is there, I wouldn't have if you talk about wanting to find an impact player right away, that's the type of player you can draft and that can make an impact. Like we saw it. I'm not going to compare the Vikings to the Bengals, but the kind of impact that we saw with Jamar Chase last year with the Bengals. Like how good an offensive playmaker can have an impact on your team right away. You can do that. And this offense can fit another high-profile playmaker to it when they run more, 11 personnel. They're not focused on having. We'll see how much fullback plays, but like in general they play more wide receivers. And Adam Thielen's going to be 32. We don't know what his future is going to look like, how well he's going to age over the next couple of years, and so they're all boom or bust if we're being honest. So we don't know how these guys are going to age. Like an Adam Thielen's going to age. He's been hurt the last couple of years. He's expensive. KJ Osborne's been solid. I don't think they have a true number two complementary player to Justin Jefferson long term. Now I'm not saying short term. I think Adam Thielen's still a really good player, but like long term they don't have that. And we talk about cutting margins with money. Why not do that? Because in a year or two, Justin Jefferson is going to cost you $30 million a year. Like that dude's going to be really expensive. Why not find another guy that gives him a running mate that's super cheap? Like, and maybe it's not in the first round, but like I just don't think it should be off the table.
Their worst performances some of these years have been when Thielen has been hurt, right? Like the Rams offense is a 3 wide receiver offense, and much like the rest of the roster, they don't have depth behind the third wide. I mean, I think Osborne developing was a great development for them last year, but they need and like Amir Smith-Marset might be that guy, right? Like there's tons of players who can be that guy, but yeah, you're right. I mean, Jamar Chase was the one player that could take the Bengals from being a 4-win team to a 10-win team. And, not all by himself, but he certainly presses that edge. And if Minnesota, look, the best draft pick in the history of the franchise took the Vikings from 9-7 to 15-1, right? Like that's
Right.
the impact a wide receiver can have. And back then it was, they had Jake Reed and Chris Carter, the first duo in the history of the NFL to do 4 1,000-yard years in a row. And they still went with Moss. Like, the fact the Vikings have Jefferson and Thielen and Osborne not preclude them from taking Garrett Wilson or Drake London's an interesting one for me. Jamison Williams is another one. He won't be ready right away, but he's super explosive. It's a good class.
Yep.
I love it. Well, we've made it. And we've done our job when we've made everybody in the comments at least a little mad over the course of the show. So all y'all, as
Eric
always, thanks for coming in.
Catching strays left and right.
We're going to have
Body
Steve
blows.
Klein versus Eric running to the podium. We might have to set up an Oklahoma drill to see who comes out on top there if Eric tries to run to the podium with the Stingley pick. I'm putting my money on Eric on that one. But all y'all, as always, thanks for coming through. Thanks for the participation. We love chopping it up with all of you every week. David, what do we got going on for the rest of the week?
We have tomorrow night Vikings happy hour at Lake Monster Brewery. We're going to do a live test
show
in preparation for day 2 of the draft, when we do our 3-day draft extravaganza, and day 2 is at the brewery. So tomorrow night we're doing it at the brewery. Come out and join us. Join the show. You get some mic time, and we can discuss some of these arguments as to who we should run up to the podium and get on day 1.
Oklahoma,
baby. Oklahoma drill. They might. Matt Lang may be up for that.
My head still hurts from the Oklahoma drill.
And then Thursday, since we had some amazing news today with the signing of Za'Darius Smith, we are having a Viking Hot Takes where Flip and his crummy internet, and he's hoping to get that better by then, and Eric Thompson will be joining. And then, of course, Saturday, you get me and Darren Campbell, 2 old bloggers.
Awesome. There it is. Well, that's it. Play the music, Dave.
Great show, everybody. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you're listening on your favorite aggregator, make sure you rate us. And always feel free to join the conversation here at Climbing the Pocket. Skol, everybody.